Welcome to the National Evaluation System for Health Technology, or NEST, RWE² forum, where we'll be talking about real-world experience in real-world evidence. We're excited to have you join us as we continue to share insights from our test cases and discuss key topics for leveraging real-world data in medical device research. As you can see from our agenda for the afternoon, we're going to talk about a pretty diverse slate of subjects in medical device studies. We have 3 deep dives on our test cases, and they're bookended really by 2 stellar panel discussions. And these will be live question and answer sessions. So please submit any questions you may have through the Q&A box in Zoom. We have a packed program, so many experts to hear from today. I want to move right into introductions for our opening session, but just to frame up kind of our discussion, a common theme that really drives NEST in all of our initiatives is diversity. We really see NEST and the coordinating center as having this unique role in the ecosystem that provides value to many different stakeholders. That includes not only industry and regulators, but also patients and providers and payers. There's also a diversity in the data that's used to generate the real-world evidence, from EHR systems, claims, registries, patient-generated health data, and patient devices. We're really looking to enhance device evaluation along the entire total product lifecycle, from pre-market to label expansion, post-market surveillance, and even coverage stages and beyond. So we're looking forward to how this diversity is reflected across our test cases this afternoon. We have adult and pediatric patient populations, specialty and disease areas, and diagnostics and traditional devices. So really excited to have this opening session. It represents the voices of our key stakeholders across the entire medical device ecosystem. My name is Siami. I head NEST, and I will be moderating this opening session. I'm going to give brief introductions of our 4 panelists, and afterwards I'll ask them to join me here on our virtual stage. First is Felipe Aguel. He is the Deputy Director in the Office of Clinical Evidence and Analysis, or OCEA, at the Food and Drug Administration Centers for Devices and Radiological Health. He's a biomedical engineer with 15 years of regulatory experience, including 12 years at the FDA. He has expertise in the fields of cardiac electrophysiology, cardiac diagnostics and monitors, neurological devices, and orthopedic devices. Also from the FDA, we have Vasum Peiris. He is the Chief Medical Officer for Pediatric and Special Populations at FDA CDRH, serving as the center's senior expert on pediatric clinical science and practice. Prior to joining the FDA, Vasum was the June Park MD Endowed Chair in Medical Excellence and Chief of both Pediatric and Adult Congenital Cardiology at Texas Tech University Health Sciences Center, the Graduate School of Biomedical Sciences, and the University Medical Center. We have Elisabeth Oehrlein, who is the Assistant Vice President of Research and Programs at the National Health Council, which she joined in 2018. She is a mixed methods researcher, and Elisabeth crafts the NHC's annual research and programmatic agenda. She leads the NHC's research and programmatic work on value, real-world evidence, and patient engagement. So thrilled to have Elisabeth as part of our panel. And last but certainly not least, we have Mohamed Salama. He is our professor of pathology at Mayo Clinic and chief medical officer. at Mayo Clinic Laboratories with a clinical background in hematopathology. Prior to his work at Mayo, Mohamed was professor of pathology at University of Utah, chief of hematopathology and vice president of the ARUP reference laboratories. Also notably, he is a NEST governing committee member as the American Clinical Laboratory Association, or ACLA, nominee. So thrilled to have Mohamed on board. So if our panelists could please join me on video, we will get started with a great discussion. I feel like the Brady Bunch. Awesome. So let me start with Felipe, because I love to pick on Felipe in any panel I'm on with him. And notably so because, as we're talking about diversity in real world evidence, the FDA did publish earlier this year those 90 selected examples, right? That comes top of mind. And so, Felipe, can you help highlight how those examples reflect diversity in data sources or specialty areas, device types, and how our participants can take away some of those learnings from those examples?
Sure. Thank you, Sandy, for having me and for a great question. The 90 examples publication that you alluded to is a selection of case studies that we wanted to compile in order to highlight precisely what you just mentioned, the diversity in data types, clinical area that for which the center has made regulatory decisions. So these are examples of real decisions made, as you mentioned earlier, on based on real world evidence, and they include diversity across the total product life cycle. Of the 90 examples, 65 were either pre-market or for label expansions. The remainder were used in a post-market setting for satisfying requirements of a post-approval study, for example. There is diversity by pre-market submission type, HDEs, de novo submissions, 510Ks, as well as the PMAs, where you might expect the real world evidence to exist or be more prevalent in those class 3 devices. We found plenty of examples for the less risky class 2 devices where real world evidence was used successfully. You alluded to the data type, and we do have diversity there from, in addition to registry data. There are examples that highlight the use of administrative claims data, annotated biospecimens, device-generated data from wearables or other monitoring equipment, medical records, next-generation sequencing, patient-generated data. So you can see it's not 90 examples of registries. Registries play an important role in real-world evidence, but they're not the whole story. And at the end of the day, we are happy to have found such a broad diversity in the data sources. And then finally, I'll mention that we do have examples. There are fields where the use of real-world evidence and registries are more mature and more prevalent. Cardiovascular comes to mind, but we did find examples in every one of our 7 OHTs, or our Offices of Health Technology, representing the different clinical areas of the devices that we review in the center, from orthopedics to neuro to general hospital, respiratory, you name it. In vitro diagnostics, radiology, there's an example across the 7 OHTs. The take-home message here is don't be afraid to take the leap and use a real-world evidence data source, for supporting a regulatory submission. The data does need to be high quality data. We are going to do a relevance and reliability and fit for purpose type review, but these 90 examples should give folks confidence that FDA has made decisions based on this data in the past and intends to continue doing so going forward, and should give folks confidence that by engaging the agency early and planning the study up front to ensure they end up with a data set that is both relevant and reliable, there is a pathway to getting their device to market or expanding indications based on real world evidence. There is a history of having done so.
That's great, Felipe, and certainly with the diversity of in therapeutic area, class of devices, the type of data source used, and all of this specifically for regulatory decision making. But let me kind of pivot to Elisabeth, and we've certainly talked about that diversity, but given your particular focus on patient engagement, real world evidence, as well as its importance to the medical device field, I wanted to ask about how can we ensure the voice of the patient is reflected throughout the total product life cycle? How can we engage patients more in the process, whether it's early in the generation, the design of studies? Do you have some examples there?
Sure, and thank you for the question. Thanks for organizing this session today. It's a great opportunity to highlight advances in the field, and also for me to be able to talk a little bit about how patients can get involved in this beyond simply being subjects within a data set. And so, I think many patient organizations have registries. And so that's one way that patient groups are certainly engaged in this. And registries can be a great opportunity to capture data about things that patients care about that might not be found in traditional EHR data or in claims data. So certainly that's one level, is to work with patient organizations and to see what types of data assets that they have in-house and how you might be able to augment data sources that you're working with those external sources of information. But I think one other really great opportunity for ensuring that the patient voice is embedded is it's very simple. It's understanding what is it that patients care about. What is it like for them getting a diagnosis? What is it like for them in terms of symptoms? And what is it that they have questions about? And to really think about, how does that impact a study design? And what can I do with traditional data sources? And so, FDA over on the CDR side has published voice of the patient reports about detailing patient experiences, treatment decision-making, and so on and so forth. Many others have published qualitative research about patient journeys and experiences. And what's interesting is that if you take that information and then you align it with the steps in a study design, thinking about who goes into your cohort, what's the follow-up time, what's the washout time, what are all of those different variables that make up study designs, there's really practical things that you can learn from patient experiences for each of those. As an example that I've learned through my own work with atrial fibrillation patients, I was focused specifically on working with younger female AFib patients. And so what I learned from talking to patients was really this delay in terms of getting a diagnosis. Oftentimes, if young women would walk into their docs and describe symptoms, they may get diagnosed with anxiety, or they might get diagnosed with something that, maybe GI disorder, something like that, that was an AFib, and maybe it took them 10 years to get an AFib diagnosis. And so that kind of information can be informative when you're thinking about, cohorts and how do you assemble cohorts and what do you look back at. Another great example that can be very tangible is, oftentimes we think about capturing data on patient-centered outcomes, that would entail looking at patient-generated data or data from patient-reported outcome measures. And that can definitely be true, but oftentimes what we find out is that patients really care about survival. In particular, we found in lung cancer that when patients are asked to discuss trade-offs, that they value prolonging life among certain subpopulations. And so that's something that can be captured in traditional RWE or RWD data sources. Time to diagnosis can also be captured. And, going back to AFib, stroke, bleeding events, those are all outcomes that patients have told us directly are very important to them and their decision-making. And so it's really all about identifying what are sources of information about patient experiences. Those may already exist, or you might partner with others to identify that. And then think very strategically about how would that impact my study design across all of the different phases of research.
And certainly the patient voice is extremely important in what clinicians or researchers might think are important, as far as outcomes may not necessarily be of as important to the patient. And so when we talk about patients, I also think about the patient that may not necessarily have a direct voice, which is the pediatric population. Typically it's their parents or caregivers, and Vasum, as you know, one of our test cases, actually the next one following this session, focuses on the pediatric population. And can you share with your experience how real-world evidence can benefit children in a way that the traditional infrastructure of medical device development and research maybe isn't there?
Yeah, thank you very much, number one, for having me on the panel. This conference seems like obviously a great progress forward with respect to how we are starting to think about real-world evidence and real-world data in a more meaningful way. To your question specifically, one of the fundamental issues that we're dealing with from a public health standpoint is a dearth of medical devices that truly are designed, evaluated, approved, labeled for pediatric patients. What we've gotten used to in the pediatric world is, quote unquote, off-label use of these devices. They need to either be utilized for populations that it hasn't been studied in, or even utilized in ways where the device is being altered. This is a little bit of where the potential of real-world data and real-world evidence comes into play. There is certainly a potential for utilizing the information, the real-world data, real-world evidence that has been developed over years with respect to off-label use to be able to engage that information towards label expansions or even iterations on devices to be more suitable or more appropriate for pediatric populations. And that is likely one of the significant potentials that real-world data has with respect to the pediatric medical device area. I won't take away too much of the thunder of the tympanostomy tube example that'll be coming up soon. I know Eric and others will be focusing a little bit more on this, but that fundamental issue in pediatrics is key. We want to continue to offer opportunities and methods by which innovators can more efficiently and effectively, without necessarily creating a higher cost or burdens to other stakeholders, develop devices that can truly make a difference in the pediatric world. Happy to get into more detail, but that I think is going to be where one of the big focuses for real-world evidence in the pediatric medical device space.
Right, and so just given my background and interest too, I always love to see how we can further research and approvals for the pediatric patients and how that fits in, because they don't have a voice of their own sometimes.
Yeah. And Sandra, if you don't mind me adding just one quick point, just so people are aware of this as a data point, when we look at our data over the last 13 years or so at CDRH with respect to the PMAs and HTEs that have been approved, we see increasing numbers generally year to year, which is a great harbinger of innovation for the US public. However, when we normalize that data towards pediatric approvals with pediatric labeling, we only see about maybe 23 to 25% over that entire 13-year period. And the reality is, quote unquote, pediatrics at CDRH obviously is 0 all the way to the day before your 22nd birthday. So when I say 23 to 25%, the vast majority of that is actually 18 and above. And most people in the pediatric field might say, well, Vasum, that's not really, doesn't really represent all of pediatrics, right? And I would have to agree. So when we really look at what's going on with respect to innovation, especially for these high risk, high benefit devices, we're seeing that only about 10% are really being developed for that less than 18, and even fewer for when we get into younger age groups, only about 2 to 3% for the NICU age range, which are those neonates, and that's a very device-rich environment as well. So just want to give folks a point about this is what's going on nationally with respect to innovation in this space, and this is why areas like real-world data, real-world evidence can really potentially make a difference here.
Absolutely, and I'm glad you brought that up too, because when the larger community thinks about the pediatric population, we tend to think less than 18 versus going up to 22 years old, and having the majority of those pediatric examples be in that higher age range. So I think you make an excellent point. I think another area that is not as researched or well developed and has been brought into the limelight with COVID and the pandemic is lab data and in vitro diagnostics and the research in that area. And so Mohamed, I know, for example, a focus of the SHIELD initiative, which for the audience is the systemic harmonization of interoperability enhancement of lab data. And a key challenge for lab data is the need to ensure that we are harmonized, that there is implementation of standards, interoperability of the information. So how important is the work in this area so that we can really unlock that potential of real world evidence in the IVD or lab space?
Thank you, Sandy, and for the invitation. It's exciting to be part of this important activity. As you indicated, the harmonization for implementation of semantic data standards is key to improve both the quality, utility, and portability of the laboratory data and in vitro diagnostic data. The one major limitation that we have today in the labs, that the codes for the lab testing in different organizations or different institutions, they are not standardized. So really the codes for lab tests and data should be interoperable. And for us to be able to achieve this interoperability, we should be able to describe the same test the same way every time, which is a major limitation we have today. By improving this interoperability of the lab data within and in between institutions, the diagnostic information can be used to better support the clinical decision and really enable the real-world evidence relevance and reliability. As you indicated, the SHIELD really support the provision of these vetted and harmonized codes from manufacturers, industry to the laboratories. This really enables consistent representation in the LIS and downstream to the electronic health record for achieving a cross-institution semantic interoperability. One thing to keep in mind that the laboratory data really represent more than 70% of the data in the electronic medical record. So as you really highlighted, labs is coming into this space now and really hold a lot of promise for contribution in this area.
Wow, and I didn't know the percentage that it occupies in the EHR. So that's even more interesting information and highlights how important it is. And
every time we draw a lab, it's in there.
I know, yeah, that's right. Great point. And but this really highlights, again, moving towards the diversity, which is kind of the theme of our opening session, of the use of the lab data and sometimes the lack thereof. So we need to increase our ability to extract that. So how do you see, Mohamed, and feel free for the rest of the panelists to jump into these questions. But specific for Mohamed, how do you see this development and use of real-world evidence in kind of the laboratory space? Are there particular pre or post-market priorities for diagnostic companies? Give me your thoughts.
Yeah, so this is a great question, Sandy. So there are two dimensions we can think of, which basically the diversity within the labs, but also the diversity between labs. Labs, they kind of are unique because they follow the clinical practice, but they also lead the clinical practice somehow. And actually, the nature of the data from that's generated in different labs could be significantly different based on the complexity of the practice, and even the type of test that's offered could be completely different, and the way they are generated. So the other dimension that we have to keep in mind is that the healthcare data should be treated as an accumulating assets that's curated, organized, and engaged with across the healthcare continuum. But as I pointed out, we need to keep in mind that 70% of these data are in the electronic medical records really come from the lab, which obviously make the potential impact to real world evidence clear. Unfortunately, today, many clinical laboratories are unable to make use of the vast amount of data stored in their system. This is largely due to the poorly developed data formatting, standardization, and lack of consideration or experience with the idea and the methods for real-world evidence data studies, particularly in the lab space. This is in addition to the limitation related to the data cleaning, storage, mining, etc. However, the advances that we are seeing in the data analytics and the increased sophistication and standardization of the lab information system, which feeds into electronic medical records, really hold significant promise to the development and the use of real-world evidence in the lab space. Now, with regard to your questions to the pre and post-market priorities for diagnostic companies, the way I see applications today for real-world evidence in the lab space, they run the spectrum all the way from establishing of reference intervals for not just different tests, but even within population within each test. Like we would be able, we're using a tool here at Mayo Clinic. It's called CLEAR. It's actually a machine learning tool developed many years back to identify reference ranges based on data collected from different institutions that provide a lot of spectrum, even within, for even a given assay, within different population, the pediatric population or neonatal population versus the adult population, the test could be completely the meaning of the results could be completely different. And this actually could have a lot of relevance to diagnostic companies knowing this information or have access to this information. The other area of application is the patient database real-time quality control for testing. The diagnostic and prognostic modeling for diseases, epidemiological investigation, lab management. We use the data all the time for lab management, and I believe that the real-world evidence could be very powerful supportive tool for our administrative and management decision that we make every day. And this could have an impact to the whole country, like the case of the COVID. We had to make decisions based on, in our lab, we serve more than 4,500 clients in the country. Early on, we actually have to make decisions on where we prioritize the volume based on, for example, hotspots, or which data we had to feed from our other system that we are connected with. The analysis of source of variation for the analytes, which again could be extremely valuable for diagnostic companies. External quality assessment. And I really believe the market priority is again, this is hard to predict, but I would say the diagnostic and prognostic modeling for diseases, the establishment of the reference intervals, and epidemiologic investigation probably would be the highest three that I would think diagnostic company would benefit from that.
Yeah, so you highlight a lot of really good areas for lab, and certainly the pandemic has really accelerated our strides in using real world data, talking about interoperability, talking about that data curation, data quality, to Felipe's point, that fit for purpose, and all of these kind of buzzwords, as I'll call them, are things that NEST is actively working on. But let me open this up to all the panelists, and as we're wrapping up this, our panel session, I do want to encourage folks, if you have a live question, please enter it in the Q&A box. But what is there's so many different things to go after. What is the biggest challenge in your mind, in each of our panelists' mind, for using real world evidence in what I'll call med tech or medical devices, and how can NEST help overcome it? That's a loaded question for you.
It is. Sandy, if you don't, I'll kick things off since everyone else is on mute. Just to answer your question directly, and I think I had a couple other comments also to maybe some of the points that have been brought up already. With respect to the biggest challenge, I think, between real world data translating into real world evidence is exactly that translation. How do we actually take the data that has, and I don't mean this in a practical sense of actually acquiring the data, although that too is a challenge, and there's a number of groups that are working on that. But how do we actually begin to translate data into scientifically valid information that our review teams can use, that truly becomes real world evidence that translates into a regulatory decision? I think that challenge is one of the areas I think Felipe has highlighted so well with respect to the breadth of areas that we've been working on, that our review teams have been working on a regular basis. So that translation is key. But I want to also point out another issue with respect to the point you brought up around diversity and inclusion. As we talked about, the use of real world data, real world evidence provides that opportunity in a regulatory setting and others to really begin to become more inclusive of various populations from a race, ethnic, socioeconomic perspective and others. But something that's interesting for us, I think, to recognize is perhaps when we think about diversity, inclusion, and equity in healthcare or any other space, but specifically here in healthcare, is where are there gaps? And sometimes, since people don't always recognize the gaps or aren't aware of the gaps, we may not be always focusing on those areas. I'll bring up an example here that is relevant to pediatrics. I really appreciated Elisabeth's example that was relevant to atrial fibrillation in women, right? Cardiovascular disease in women, a significant issue. In pediatrics and in the laboratory space, this might be something that most people may not be aware of, but the vast majority of heme analyzer devices that are out there have not necessarily always been evaluated specifically on pediatric samples. Mohamed brought up the point that there are variations with respect to how any specific laboratory test, the same test, for instance, is evaluated in an adult population versus an adolescent population versus a younger population, or especially in a neonatal population. And with respect to the issue around the pandemic, a very clear example that I just had a conversation with a colleague very recently about is troponin. Troponin is a laboratory test that we use in the cardiovascular space to understand cardiovascular function, heart cardiovascular failure, perhaps an insult that has happened to the heart muscle. And despite that, and despite the fact that we use those types of laboratories like troponin, BNP, brain natriuretic peptide in pediatric patients on a regular basis, it's always been left up to the pediatric academic medical centers and their laboratories to be able to figure out what are the reference values for different ages in pediatrics. What's normal, what's abnormal? Is it, and that just gets more and more subcategorized when we think about pediatrics with respect to racial and ethnic diversity issues as well. And that's very relevant to the current pandemic conversation because we're trying to more effectively understand myocarditis, which is an inflammation of the heart muscle, especially after vaccinations or in relation to having had COVID. So it really brings to the fore things that pediatric medicine and all of my pediatric colleagues have known forever, and we've just been dealing with, that perhaps everyone else may not always recognize those inequities with respect to pediatrics in our healthcare system and some of the regulatory environment that we work in daily.
I'm happy to jump in next. I think those are all really important points. And, I think certainly continuing the trajectory that NEST is already moving in, thinking about how do we link laboratory data, all of these types of areas I think are super important, the pediatric population certainly. But I also think one of the areas that's very exciting that NEST is moving into is with digital health tools. This strikes me as an area that is a little bit of a wild west and could use some structure and definitions and terminology. And so I think it's a great opportunity for NEST to collaborate with others and to really lead the way to think about what fits under that umbrella, what has to undergo regulatory review, what type of evidence needs to be supplied, what's fit for purpose in that particular context. What does a reevaluation look like on tools when one of the greatest strengths is actually that they can continue with machine learning and get better over time? How do we approach that? And how do we ensure that the data that's generated is used, but then also privacy of individuals is protected? And then not to mention how should digital health tools be reimbursed over time? And so I think, through continuous pilot studies, test cases, so on and so forth within the space of digital health, I think will be really helpful. One, kind of area that we hear about a lot in the policy space, in addition to within patient community, is about how do outcomes differ for healthcare delivered via telehealth versus in-person care, and how does that differ across different populations? And so certainly with telemedicine, being a digital health tool and certainly being embedded within traditional real-world data sources, I think that's an area that there's a lot of opportunity and that I'd love to see NEST continuing to explore.
Thank you. And just before, sorry, Felipe. So I could not have planned this. I didn't pay you, but you brought up digital health, and our closing session is on digital health and those technologies. So that's a teaser for folks to wait. But thank you, Elisabeth, for that. Felipe, I'm sorry, I interrupted you.
No worries, Sandy. I think Vasum said it really well when he said what we're all aiming for here is to be able to take this massive amount of data and turn it into usable real-world evidence, turning it into information. You know, one of the keys, we've shown that individual sponsors have been able to do that. But the ideal would be for not, not having to reinvent that wheel and figure it out every single time that a study is being done. And that's where I think NEST can really help move the ecosystem in a direction where there is more standardization, not with a capital S ISO standards type standards, but with a lowercase s, where to Mohamed's point earlier, the lab codes are standard across the board. How we capture data provenance in a data source is done in a similar fashion across the board. How we can ascertain device exposure, not just which specific device was used, but also where and how it was used when that's a relevant question to ensure that the data can be used for regulatory purposes. You know, having to figure out all of these things every single time is something we'd like to be, we'd like to be in a spot where there's at least a starting point that isn't scratch for sponsors as they embark upon these studies. That's where I see NEST's contribution here.
So a couple of questions. Sorry, Vasum, I'll let you finish, but I have a couple of questions I want to get to, and our time is, we've got 3 minutes left, but I'll let you finish your thoughts. Sorry for interrupting.
No, didn't mean to interrupt, but very quickly to Felipe's point, that is extremely important. I'll just point out, in addition to the work that NEST is doing, some of you may know that we've also funded 3 of our pediatric device consortia campuses to focus on pediatric issues, pediatric health system areas around real-world data, real-world evidence. And one of the areas, and again, didn't pay Felipe for this, and we didn't think of talk about it beforehand, but one of the areas that one of the teams is working on is how do we begin to standardize the approaches to utilizing real-world data and translating that into real-world evidence for pediatrics. I'll stop there because I know you got other things to go on.
Absolutely, but it's a great point, right? Talking about standardization, we have a question on, there's certainly gaps in the diversity in medtech, and specifically when we're talking about self-reported racial and ethnic identities, frequently those options are preloaded or pre-specified, and how can we move the needle for a more standardized kind of approach to even something like that, right?
It's an extremely important point. I'll give a very relevant personal example. When I was faculty in Texas, one of the interesting aspects about that preloaded point that the audience member pointed out is that there were only really a couple of designations for your race, ethnicity, Black, white, or Hispanic. That was it in the health system in terms of how people can report. So we need to be more cognizant of greater diversity to become more inclusive. And I think our society as a whole, as a national conversation, and certainly as a global conversation, we're moving in that direction. Some of this is old hat to so many of us that have spent our lives in that area, in those areas, but to others, it's coming to recognition, it's coming to a better understanding. So that's number one. But especially to kind of take this to the bigger point about medtech and how do we begin to increase diversity, I think again recognizing where those gaps are is an important one. And I'll point out since I'm the pediatric representative here in this setting, that those issues we haven't even really begun to address them as significantly in the pediatric world as perhaps as effectively as we have in the adult medical world. There are certainly aspects of race and ethnicity that influence pediatric care. However, the surrogates are likely the more influential factors. What I mean by surrogates are issues around socioeconomic position, the zip code in which a family lives or a child grows up in. That is so influential with respect to the care that they receive. In addition to that, the type of insurance they have, public versus private, that influences the type of care a child will receive and a family will receive. So when we try to translate, race, ethnicity, and inclusion aspects into the pediatric world, we have to be cognizant of some of those unique aspects in pediatrics, just as we need to do in so many other areas in pediatrics.
That's great. And we are 1 minute over time. So I'm going to wrap this up, but I always underestimate the amount of engagement I get from the panelists for these sessions. It has been fantastic. Thank you so much. Felipe, Elisabeth, Mohamed, Vasum, you guys are awesome. #Nest rocks. And so hopefully this has energized our participants too, as much as I'm now energized for the afternoon to come. So coming up next is our test case presentation on pediatric clinical and health services outcomes following TTI. Please enjoy.